blacknose.ie. They are quite a sight to see. Now, we turn to an issue now that in so many ways remains hidden in rural Ireland: domestic abuse and violence. The number of people seeking help has increased dramatically in the last year, and there is not a corner of the country that is free from the scourge of it. So what are the challenges faced by those who live in rural areas who are subjected to violence in their own homes, and are there enough supports available to them? Tara Farrell heads up Longford's Women's Link, a community organisation that supports victims of rural domestic violence. Good morning, Tara, and thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning, Ella.
Tara, can I just start by clarifying something? When we talk about domestic violence, is it correct to say that the vast majority of perpetrators of violence are men against women?
It would be fair to say, Ella, we would look at the Women's Aid statistics and research, and which says that 1 in 4 women in Ireland who have been in a relationship have been abused by a current or former partner. And if we look even at the statistics around femicide, 244 women have been killed since 1996 up till January this year. And in over half of the resolved cases, they were killed by a current or ex-partner. So the figures are quite stark, to put things in context.
What do we know about the prevalence of domestic violence in rural Ireland, be it on or off farm? How also is it distinctly different from abuse in urban settings?
It's very, very different. To give you the example of Longford, where we're based, and I've no reason to believe that we are an outlier in any of this, that this will be quite typical for a lot of rural communities, we would see approximately 400 women a year. Now, that is an increase over the last couple of years with the pandemic, and over half of those would live in rural areas. But that said, Longford itself is quite a rural county, so even if they are living in a town, they're often rural towns. And the experience of women living in rural areas is very, very different from women living in urban areas. So first of all, for abusers, it's much easier to isolate and to control their victims. And for those of us, I live in a rural area myself, there's huge positives. We often have this lovely romantic notion of living in rural Ireland, and there's always
close-knit community.
And that's lauded as something really positive, which it is. But sometimes when you flip it on its head, that strong community spirit and that close-knit atmosphere can actually be an enabler of abuse, because it allows the abuser to continue his control, to continue his abuse. We know in rural Ireland there's reduced access to services, things like maybe poorer mobile phone coverage, broadband and so on. There are more dangers, particularly in farms. Implements in farm machinery that you and I may see as just part of the normal running order of a farm can, in the hands of an abuser, be very, very dangerous. And then, we've heard from previous callers this morning about the emotional attachment to land, and the implications then for women in terms of farm ownership and the financial abuse that can go on. So there's a wide range of issues. Like transport is a huge one. The length of time it can take for a woman to seek a service. We also know that rural women are less likely to access services, and older women in particular living in rural communities are also less likely, which is really concerning.
And as always, it is, thanks to brave and courageous women who tell their stories that we can understand this. You hear from these people. What are they saying to you?
We hear quite a lot from women who talk about that close-knit community that they live in. They say things like, my parents know what's going on, but my father is older and he needs to rely on the neighbours and on the locals to help him out on the farm. So he's not going to block him out. He's not going to isolate him. We hear that within communities, people are very, very reluctant to isolate an abuser. If they need him for the silage, they're not going to do that. We also know that if a woman is seen maybe getting a taxi from the house, if a Garda car pulls up outside the house, everybody knows about it very, very quickly. What one woman has said to us that, and these are her words, that it wasn't an easy time when she went to court to get an order. It was embarrassing. She had to ask a neighbour for a lift into the town. And what she said was that everyone knows when the Gardaí have called to my house, and the location of where we lived, I also feel gave him the freedom to do what he liked to me. So that's really, really stark. She was very, very isolated, very, very alone, and she spoke about the abuse that when it got increasingly bad, her screams got louder and louder. She would say she'd look out the window and all that she could see that could hear her screams were the green fields, and that she was so isolated and nobody ever came. She would bring her children, walking the fields to keep them safe, and she was happy at that stage knowing that they were away from him.
And you said earlier that older rural women are particularly vulnerable as well.
They are particularly vulnerable, and, particularly when we think about things like financial abuse. A lot of older women, they have worked on the farm, they have reared the children, they haven't worked outside the home, they don't have access to independent income. So, one older woman had said to us that, if she was to leave, where would she go? Where is suitable, in her words, for an elderly woman, and what would happen to the animals? So there's huge concern, there's huge worry, and there's huge isolation for women.
There was a UK report in 2019 by the National Rural Crime Network, and I've read it. There are some really stark findings there. Rural victims are half as likely to report their abuse to others. They cannot access support services. The policing response is inadequate. They live in a society, close-knit communities, as you mentioned, that can sometimes unknowingly protect the perpetrators, and they feel isolated, unsupported, unprotected in this kind of rural hell that they're living in. Is there any reason to think that it is different here?
There isn't really. I, having read that report, can recognise an awful lot of what is being said in it. And it talks about that hidden underbelly of domestic violence and, the barriers of transport, the access to services, the very structures in rural communities that a lot of us think are so positive, but often facilitate abuse in plain sight.
And do we need more research? Do we need some research?
We absolutely do need some research. We're starting to gather very anecdotal data ourselves as one service, but we do need much more widespread research into this.
From a policy perspective, what supports do you think are needed to help those who are subjected to abuse and violence in rural Ireland?
Well, we've seen that the draft strategy on domestic and sexual and gender-based violence is now in its consultation stage, and there's a lot of positives in that. But again, the devil will be in the detail around implementation. Resources are key, multi-annual funding, resources around services, but also a community-led response to this, because this is happening in our communities, and we might not like to think that it is, but it absolutely is. And we need to adopt that zero tolerance culture for domestic abuse in rural communities. So we need a multi-pronged approach, because it's such a complex issue.
There are women listening this morning who might recognise their own situations in what you have described. What can they do?
What I would recommend is that they look at the Safe Ireland website and look at wherever they're living. There are support services within their counties, and they are listed on the website. They can also call the Women's Aid National Free Phone Helpline on 1-800-341-900.
And I suppose also the abusers, the perpetrators of violence are listening, some of them right now. What is your message to them?
My message is that they would stop what they're doing. Unfortunately, a lot of the perpetrators, and if they are listening in this morning, will not recognise that in themselves because of the sense of control and power that they have asserted over their family.
Well, Tara Farrell, thank you very much indeed for coming in this morning. And if you need to talk to someone about the issues raised, there is a list of helplines on safeireland.ie, or the National Helpline for Women's Aid, as you say, is 1800 341 900. Just briefly, what do you think neighbours could do, the community, the close-knit community can do to support?
What we would always say, if you suspect a relative or a neighbour or friend is experiencing domestic violence, there is that urge within us, that instinct that you want to go in and help and get her out of there. But we have to remember that she has been managing this situation for a very, very long time. We would always say to follow her lead. She knows what is safe for her and for her family, and just keep up the contact with her, keep up the texts, keep up the phone calls, even though she may not answer, even though you may ring her and you might hear who's that in the background. Keep the contact with her, because hopefully one day she will be able to reach out.
And finally, I was struck by a mention of hedge cutting. Why is that such a bad thing?
Some women will tell us that they dread certain times of the year, particularly with hedge cutting, because things are much more visible then, and that the perpetrator can see if they're leaving the house. They may then get a text saying what time they left at and what time they should be back at. So it's all about that visibility in rural Ireland, and the very structures that, as I said, a lot of us feel are very positive are the very structures that can enable abuse to continue.
Tara Farrell, thank you very much indeed. And that's safeireland.ie or 1800 341 900. Now, the war in Ukraine has cast